The trucks started arriving before the sun was fully up. 5 of them, then 6, then 7, parked along the gravel shoulder outside a building that still had the word ICE fading on its brick face. Crates of tomatoes and peppers sat in truck beds, tarps thrown over some, nothing over others. A man in a ball cap checked a clipboard nailed to a post near the loading dock. Farmers leaned against tailgates, drinking coffee out of thermoses, waiting their turn. Nobody standing there that morning would have guessed that 3 years earlier, this same building had been the punchline of a county auction. Nobody would have guessed that a 21-year-old named Malik had bought it for $300 while half the county laughed. But that morning, the same men who once laughed were the ones parked outside, waiting for a time slot. Malik walked the line of trucks with his own clipboard, calling out names, checking the board, keeping the schedule moving. He didn't stop to think about how strange it was. He just kept working. To understand why farmers were lining up outside an old Icehouse, you had to go back to the auction where it all started. The county held its surplus and tax sale auction twice a year, out behind the courthouse annex in Bellevue, Georgia. Folding chairs sat in uneven rows on cracked pavement, and by 10 in the morning the summer heat was already pressing down hard enough to make the air shimmer over the asphalt. Old farmers sat with paper fans made from auction flyers. A few local contractors walked the property list with their arms crossed, sizing up demolition costs before the bidding even started. The auctioneer, a heavy-set man named Dale Purnell, worked through a list of tax-forfeited parcels with the same flat rhythm he used every spring and every fall. Most of what came up that day was unremarkable: a vacant lot here, a collapsed tobacco barn there, a stretch of fence line nobody wanted. Then Dale held up a faded photograph clipped to his list. "Next lot," he said, "Old Bellevue Ice and Cold Storage, corner of Route 9 and Miller Road." A ripple of laughter moved through the folding chairs before he even finished the sentence. Somebody in the back said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "That thing's still standing?" The photograph showed a squat brick building with a crooked metal door, weeds pushing up through the parking apron, and the faded outline of block letters that used to spell ICE across the front. Dale read off the details in his flat auctioneer voice. Refrigeration system non-operative, roof in disrepair, utilities disconnected, sold as is, no warranty expressed or implied. "Who wants a demolition project?" Dale asked, and a few people chuckled again. An older bidder near the front, a heavy-set white man named Roy Callison, who ran a small excavation business, shook his head and muttered something to the man next to him about tear-down costs eating any bid alive. Dale opened the bidding at $500. Nobody raised a card. He dropped it to $400. Still nothing. Malik sat near the back in a folding chair he'd borrowed from his mother's produce stand, wearing a faded gray t-shirt with the sleeves rolled from a morning spent loading crates. He wasn't planning to bid on anything. He'd come with his mother's cousin to watch a small piece of farmland go up later in the list, mostly out of curiosity, but something about the Icehouse photograph kept pulling his eyes back to it. He had spent 3 summers helping load and unload produce trucks at Renner Family Farm Stand, the roadside stand his mother ran off Route 9, and 2 of those summers doing seasonal work at Hastings Farm Supply, where he'd helped with everything from stacking feed bags to patching a walk-in cooler compressor when the regular repairman was out sick. He knew what a working cold room felt like when you stepped inside it, and he knew what farmers complained about at the end of a long harvest day. Dale dropped the price again. $300, he said, sounding like a man ready to move on to the next lot. Malik lifted his bidder card before he'd fully decided to. The crowd went quiet for half a second, and then the laughter started for real. $300 for that? Someone called out. "Son, you just bought yourself a demolition bill," Roy Callison said, shaking his head with something between amusement and pity. "Hope you like mold," another voice added, and a few people around him laughed harder. Dale looked over his glasses at Malik, checked to see if anyone else wanted in, and when nobody raised a card against him, he brought the gavel down. "Sold, $300 to bidder 41. Malik walked up to sign the paperwork while Roy Callison watched him from his chair, arms crossed, already shaking his head slowly like he was watching a man walk into a wall he couldn't see. That evening, Malik's mother, Denise, stood behind the register at the produce stand and listened to him explain what he'd done. She didn't yell. She just set down the bag of peaches she was weighing and looked at him for a long moment. $300 is the truck's alternator, she said quietly. The family's delivery truck had been running rough for 2 months, and they both knew what that alternator money was supposed to go toward. I know, Malik said. I'll figure it out. Denise didn't argue further, but the worry stayed on her face for the rest of the night, and Malik felt it every time she glanced his way while ringing up customers. His younger sister, Ayana, thought the whole thing was funny until she found out the $300 had come out of money that was supposed to help cover her school supply list, and then it stopped being funny to her too. Malik didn't sleep much that night. He kept turning over the same question in his head. What had he actually just bought? The next afternoon, he drove out to the building with a flashlight and a crowbar, since the front door lock had rusted solid. Up close, the Icehouse looked even rougher than the auction photo had suggested. The metal door on the west side hung crooked on one hinge, and weeds had pushed clean through cracks in the loading apron. Inside, the smell hit him first, a heavy, damp, mildew smell that made him breathe through his mouth for the first few minutes. His flashlight beam crossed rusted pallet racks, a floor stained dark in patches, and a compressor unit against the back wall that looked like it hadn't run in a decade. Water stains spread down one wall from a section of roof that had clearly been leaking for years. For a moment, standing there in the dark with the smell in his nose, Malik felt exactly like Roy Callison had predicted he would feel, like a man who'd paid $300 for a headache. Then he noticed something that made him stop moving. He put his hand against the interior wall, and even in the summer heat outside, the wall felt noticeably cool to the touch. He walked deeper into the building and found that it wasn't one open room, but several separate chambers, each with its own heavy insulated door, thick enough that closing one behind you muffled the outside world almost completely. The floors in each chamber sloped gently toward a drain in the corner. The loading dock outside, cracked as it was, still sat at exactly the right height for a farm truck bed. He stood in the middle of the darkest chamber for a long time, running his flashlight along the walls, doing the kind of quiet math a person does when they're trying to talk themselves out of a bad feeling. The building was ugly and broken, but the bones of it, the insulation, the separate cold chambers, the drainage, the dock, none of that had rotted away with everything else. He didn't know yet what he was going to do with it, but he knew the mockers at the auction had been pricing the building by how it looked, and he was starting to price it by what was still underneath the mess. His first idea was simple, and in hindsight, wrong. He figured if the building used to be a working icehouse and cold storage facility, the fastest path forward was to get the old refrigeration system running again. He called a refrigeration contractor out of the next county over, a man named Gerald Whitfield, who'd been doing commercial cooling work for almost 30 years. Gerald walked the building slowly, tapping on pipes, checking the compressor, running numbers in a small notebook. When he'd finished, he sat down on an overturned crate and gave Malik the kind of look a doctor gives a patient before delivering bad news. "This compressor's dead, and I mean dead," Gerald said. "Even if I could get parts for it, which I probably can't, the whole electrical service here is 30 years out of date, and the refrigerant this system used isn't even legal to work with anymore." Malik asked what it would cost to bring the whole system back the way it used to be. Gerald did some rough math out loud. New compressor, refrigerant conversion, full electrical upgrade, insulation repair, and landed somewhere between $40,000 and $60,000. "For a building this size, in this shape, I wouldn't recommend it," Gerald said. "You'd be better off building new somewhere else, if you had that kind of money, which most folks don't." Malik thanked him, paid him for the visit, and sat alone in his truck outside the Icehouse for a long while after Gerald drove off. He had $300 in a building, and the plan he'd walked in with, fix the old system, reopen it as an Icehouse, was dead before it started. For the next few weeks, Malik went back to his normal routine, helping at the produce stand, loading trucks for Hastings Farm Supply, trying not to think too hard about the empty building sitting off Route 9. But the routine itself was what changed his thinking. One Thursday afternoon in late June, a tomato grower named Otis Freeman pulled up to the Renner stand with a truck bed full of crates and a face that said the day had already gone wrong. Market's flooded, Otis said, shaking his head as he helped unload a few crates onto the stand's table. Everybody's tomatoes came in the same week this year, and the buyers in Macon are only paying half what they were paying last month. He explained that he either had to sell what he had that same evening at whatever price he could get, or haul the rest 3 hours to a cold storage warehouse near Atlanta that charged more in gas and fees than most small growers could justify for one truckload. By tomorrow, half of this is soft, Otis said, tapping a crate. I don't have anywhere to put it that keeps it good. Malik had heard some version of that complaint from growers his whole life, but that afternoon it landed differently. He started asking Otis more questions than usual. How long could the tomatoes hold if kept cool? How far did he normally have to drive for storage? What did storage cost when he used it? How often did a glut like this happen during the season? Otis answered without really noticing he was being asked anything unusual, the way people do when they're just venting about their day. Malik kept the answers in his head the whole drive home. Over the next 2 weeks, he asked the same questions of half a dozen other growers who came through the stand: a peach farmer named Louis Tran, a cucumber grower named Mavis Odell, a young couple who grew sweet corn out past the county line. A pattern started to form. None of them needed a giant industrial warehouse. What they needed was somewhere close, somewhere cheap, somewhere they could drop off a partial truckload for a night or two, just long enough to avoid selling into a bad price the same evening it was picked. Malik thought back to standing in that dark, cool chamber at the Icehouse, and for the first time the shape of an idea clicked into place. The building didn't need to become a modern industrial cold storage facility. It only needed to solve one specific problem for a small number of people, buying them a little bit of time. He drove back out to the Icehouse that same week and looked at it with new eyes. He wasn't going to fix everything. He was going to fix one room. He picked the smallest of the insulated chambers, the one closest to the loading dock, and made a short list of exactly what it needed: a patched section of roof directly above it, a repaired door seal, one modern used refrigeration unit sized for a single small room instead of the whole building, and just enough electrical work to run that one unit safely. He went back to Gerald Whitfield with the smaller plan instead of the old one. Gerald looked at the sketch Malik had drawn and nodded slowly. "That's a lot more reasonable," he said. "A used split system sized for one room, new circuit just for that room. Patch the roof over it. I can get you a number for that." The number came back around $6,000, which was still real money, but nothing like the $40,000 to $60,000 from before. Malik didn't have $6,000 sitting around, so he did the work in pieces over the following month, using savings from his job at Hastings Farm Supply, a small loan from an uncle, and weekends spent doing as much of the non-electrical labor himself as Gerald would allow. He patched the roof section himself with materials from Hastings Farm Supply, using a discount his old boss gave him for buying in bulk. He replaced the door seals on the one chamber by hand, cleaned the floor drain, scrubbed the walls down with a sanitizing solution he researched from food safety guidelines for produce storage. He installed a simple digital thermometer inside the room, the kind that could be checked from outside without opening the heavy door. By the middle of July, one small cold room inside the old Icehouse was clean, sealed, and holding a steady temperature for the first time in years. He didn't advertise, didn't put up a sign, didn't tell anyone outside his family what he'd built. Instead, he went back to Otis Freeman. "I've got one cold room working," Malik said. "Not the whole building, just one room, but it holds steady and it's clean." Otis looked skeptical, the way most people look when someone younger than their own children tells them about a new plan. "How much you charging?" Otis asked. Malik offered him a test. 20 crates, one night, almost nothing. Just enough to prove it worked. Otis agreed mostly because it cost him next to nothing to find out, and because he had extra tomatoes sitting in his truck bed anyway that were headed for a distressed sale. That night, Malik helped Otis load the 20 crates into the cold room himself, checking the stacking so air could move around each layer. The next morning, Otis came back before the produce stand even opened. Malik walked him into the room and pulled a crate down for him to check. The tomatoes were still firm, still holding good color, nothing like the soft, sweating fruit that had been sitting in a truck bed overnight in July heat. Otis didn't say much, just nodded and rubbed the back of his neck. "All right," he said. "All right, that's something." He paid the small fee Malik had quoted, took his tomatoes to a buyer 2 days later at a better price than he'd been able to get the week before, and came back the following Thursday with another truckload. Word moved slowly at first, the way it does in a farming county where people trust what they've seen with their own eyes more than anything they've heard. Louis Tran came by after hearing about it from Otis at the feed store. Mavis Odell came by a few weeks after that. By late summer, Malik had 4 or 5 regular growers using the one cold room on a rotating basis, paying by the crate or by the pallet for overnight holding. It wasn't much money yet, but it was real, and it was proof that the idea worked. One afternoon in early September, Malik noticed something happening that he hadn't planned for. Louis Tran and Mavis Odell had both dropped off produce the same week, each with amounts too small on their own to justify the drive to a regional buyer 3 hours away. But sitting together in the cold room, their combined loads were almost enough to fill a full truck. Malik mentioned this out loud to Louis almost as an afterthought, and Louis's face changed. "You're saying if we combined our loads, we could split one truck instead of each of us driving separate," Louis said slowly. "That's what it looks like." Malik answered. They tried it that week. Louis and Mavis each brought their crates to the Icehouse. Malik held them for 2 days, graded and labeled them by owner, and arranged for one truck to carry the combined load to a produce buyer near Macon. The math worked out better for everyone. Louis and Mavis split the cost of the truck instead of each paying full freight alone, and the buyer got a fuller, more efficient shipment instead of 2 small partial loads. Malik charged a small aggregation fee on top of the storage fee, keeping ownership of the produce clear the whole time. The tomatoes were still Otis's tomatoes. The corn was still the young couple's corn. He was just the point where it all came together and moved out on a schedule. That was the moment the business stopped being just a cold room for hire and started becoming something closer to a small hub. Word spread faster after that, and by the following spring, Malik had 8 or 9 regular growers using the building. But growing faster brought its own problems, and the biggest one arrived on a hot week in June, almost exactly a year after he'd bought the building. Word had gotten around that the Icehouse could hold produce through a bad market week, and that spring's harvest came in heavier than anyone expected. Farmer after farmer called or stopped by asking if Malik had room. He did have room, technically, in the sense that there was still floor space in the one working chamber. What he didn't have was airflow. He knew, even as he was doing it, that stacking that many crates that tightly was pushing past what the room could safely handle. But turning growers away felt like turning away the whole reason the business existed, and he was afraid that if he said no, they'd remember it and go somewhere else next time. So he said yes to almost everyone that week, and the crates went in tight, row after row, barely any gap left for cold air to circulate between them. The single refrigeration unit ran nearly non-stop trying to keep up, and within 2 days, the temperature in the back corner of the room, farthest from the vents, had crept up several degrees above where it needed to be. Mavis Odell was the one who found out first. She came to pick up her cucumbers for a Thursday delivery and pulled a crate from the back corner to find them soft, some already showing spoilage at the edges. She didn't yell, but her disappointment was worse than yelling would have been. "I trusted this room," she said quietly, standing in the doorway with the ruined crate in her hands. Malik checked the rest of the back stock and found 2 other growers had product affected as well, though not as badly as Mavis's. He didn't try to explain it away or blame the heat outside. He told each of them plainly that he had known the room was near capacity and had taken on more than it could safely hold anyway. He reimbursed Mavis for the full value of her spoiled cucumbers, even though the payment ate most of what the business had earned that month. He offered discounted future storage to the other 2 growers whose product had been partially affected, and he disposed of what couldn't be salvaged instead of trying to pass any of it along. Mavis didn't come back for almost 2 months after that. Word of the spoiled crates moved through the same channels that had once carried word of his success, and for a while, a couple of growers who'd been thinking about trying the Icehouse decided to wait and see instead. It was the lowest point since the auction, and it forced Malik to sit with a harder truth than the one Gerald Whitfield had handed him a year earlier. The problem wasn't that the room was too small. The problem was that he had been thinking about capacity as square footage instead of as something closer to a science. Cold storage wasn't just a space you filled up until it was full. It depended on airflow between crates, on how close product could safely sit to the walls, on how many times a day the door could be opened before the room lost its temperature stability, on how different produce behaved differently in the same conditions. Space alone didn't equal usable capacity, and he had learned that the expensive way. Over the following weeks, Malik built something he should have built from the start, an actual operating system for the room. Instead of just goodwill and open floor space, he worked out a maximum pallet count for the chamber based on airflow, not just how many crates could physically fit. He marked lanes on the floor with tape, so crates were always stacked with a gap for cold air to move. He set intake windows, specific times of day when growers could drop off product, instead of an open-door policy that let people show up whenever they wanted. He kept a written temperature log, checked twice a day, and installed a simple alarm sensor that would alert him if the temperature drifted out of range. He created a basic reservation system, a chalkboard near the office door, where growers could pencil in the pallets they needed ahead of time, so he always knew exactly how close the room was to its real limit before saying yes to anyone. No overbooking, no matter how badly he wanted the revenue. He went back to Mavis personally to explain the changes, not to ask forgiveness so much as to show her what had actually changed. It took her a few more weeks to bring product back, but she did, cautiously at first, watching the temperature log himself when he wasn't looking, before trusting the room again the way she had before. By the following spring, the system was holding steady, and the one room was running close to its real capacity without another failure. That was when Malik decided it was time to open the second chamber, but only after he understood the first one completely. He went back to Gerald Whitfield again, this time asking for a second used refrigeration unit, sized slightly differently to give him flexibility for produce that preferred different holding temperatures. The second room cost more than the first because he now understood exactly what he needed instead of guessing. And by that point, the business had enough steady income from the first room to make a small equipment loan worth pursuing. He walked into a credit union in town with a folder of paperwork instead of just an idea. The loan officer, a woman named Patricia Bowles, looked over his application and then looked up at him with an expression that mixed doubt and curiosity. "You want us to finance an old Icehouse you bought at auction for $300, she said, not quite a question. Malik didn't get defensive. He slid the folder across the desk, paid invoices from growers going back over a year, a simple ledger of occupancy in the one working room, letters from 3 of his regular customers, and the temperature logs he'd kept faithfully since the overcapacity failure. Patricia flipped through the pages slowly, pausing on the temperature logs longer than anything else. "This is more organized than half the small businesses that walk in here," she said eventually. The credit union approved a modest equipment loan, enough to cover the second refrigeration unit and the wiring it required, and Malik installed it that summer with Gerald's help. The second room gave him real flexibility for the first time, one chamber for produce that needed slightly cooler holding, one for produce that did better a few degrees warmer, and enough combined space to handle 2 full harvest days without stacking anything past what the airflow could support. He had also learned, the hard way, that not every crop could safely share the same chamber, since some produce released gases that sped up ripening in whatever sat next to it. So he started separating loads by temperature range and compatibility, instead of just by whichever room happened to be open. Word had fully turned by then. Growers who had been cautious after the spoilage incident came back once they saw the new reservation board and heard about the temperature logs. New growers who'd never used the Icehouse before started asking around after hearing that Malik didn't overbook anymore, that he turned people away rather than risk another bad batch. Turning people down, strangely, had become the thing that made people trust him more. One afternoon that fall, a familiar truck pulled up to the loading dock, and Malik recognized the driver before the man even stepped out. It was Roy Callison, the excavation contractor who'd laughed the loudest at the auction 2 years earlier. Roy had picked up a small produce operation on the side, mostly for his own family, but had gotten into a bigger planting than he could manage on his own that season. He walked up slowly, looking around at the loading dock, the reservation board, the trucks parked in an orderly line waiting their turn. "Still got room?" Roy asked, not quite meeting Malik's eyes at first. "Tomorrow afternoon," Malik said, checking the board. "Put me down for 12 pallets," Roy said. Malik wrote his name on the board without any speech, without bringing up the demolition bill comment from 2 years before, and Roy nodded once and walked back to his truck. That was the whole exchange, and it was enough. By the 3rd year, the Icehouse had grown into something that would have been unrecognizable to the crowd who'd laughed at the auction, though it still looked, from the outside, almost exactly the same. 2 working cold rooms ran on a steady schedule, with a young cousin of Malik's helping manage intake during peak weeks, and a part-time helper who handled loading and stacking under the airflow rules Malik had built after the failure. Roughly 20 growers used the building regularly by that point, some for simple overnight holding, others as part of the aggregation service that combined smaller loads into fuller truck shipments headed toward regional buyers. By the end of that 3rd year, the Icehouse was generating a little over $300,000 in annual revenue through storage fees, handling fees, aggregation fees, and a small premium for growers who reserved guaranteed capacity ahead of harvest. That number wasn't profit, and Malik knew the difference better than anyone, since electricity, refrigeration maintenance, insurance, labor, cleaning, property taxes, and the equipment loan all came out of it before anything else did. What was left over, though, was real money, enough to cover every one of those costs with something left over that a smaller operation could never have produced. It wasn't the kind of number that made anyone rich overnight, but it was steady, and it was earned the same way every dollar of it had been earned from the start: 1 room, 1 farmer, 1 careful decision at a time. At home, the changes were smaller, but just as real. The family-produced Stan's old delivery truck finally got its overdue repairs, the alternator replaced along with a few other things that had been deferred too long. Denise stopped worrying every time Malik brought up the Icehouse, and eventually started sending overflow produce from the stand there herself during heavy weeks, the way any other grower in the county did. Ayana's school expenses stopped being a source of quiet tension around the kitchen table. None of it happened in a single dramatic moment. It happened the way most real change happens, a little at a time, until one day the pressure that used to sit over the family's shoulders simply wasn't there anymore. That brought the story back to the morning where it began, with 7 trucks parked along the gravel shoulder outside a building, with a fading ice sign still visible above the door. Malik walked the line with his clipboard, calling names off the reservation board, waving trucks toward the dock one at a time as space opened up inside. Roy Callison's truck sat 3rd in line that morning, his tailgate down, crates of squash stacked and waiting. Otis Freeman leaned against his truck bed near the front, drinking coffee, chatting with Mavis Odell about the season so far. Inside, the 2 cold rooms held steady at their marked temperatures, the digital thermometers glowing quietly by each door, the floor lanes still taped in clean lines to keep the air moving the way it needed to. The building still looked like what it was, an old, plain, unglamorous structure that had clearly been through decades of weather and neglect. The paint was still faded in places. The concrete apron outside still carried old cracks that had never been fully repaired, but the doors opened and closed on schedule. Now, the drains ran clear, and every crate that came through had a place to go and a time to be there. Somewhere in the small office attached to the loading dock, tucked into the top drawer of an old metal desk, sat a folded paper bidder card with the number 41 still printed across the front. Malik didn't look at it often, and he never mentioned it to customers. It just stayed there, in the drawer, the same way the old ice letters stayed faded but visible above the door, a small reminder of a $300 bid that everyone else in the room had been sure was a mistake. Outside, the line of trucks kept moving, one at a time, toward a building nobody else had wanted.